welcome. This is Deborah Cat, and you are listening to the Better Sex Podcast, the home of unfiltered conversations about sex and relationships and how to make them better. In these conversations, I sit down with all sorts of interesting humans and discuss ideas and strategies that you can try at home so that we can all have better sex. It is my mission to fill the world with masterful lovers. I believe that better sex makes for a better world. So if you want to do your part and help create a better world, please hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment. And if you have questions about sex and relationships for me and my guests, please email deborahtantracat@gmail.com. The information is in the show notes below. So today I'm going to turn the tables and the mic around and have my dear friend and co-conspirator interview me. My dear friend, Missy Singer DuMars, is a conscious businesswoman, a mindful farmer, a curious cook, spiritual seeker, and the hostess of the Women in Food podcast. She is also a big part of why this podcast has come to be. So on that note, I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself, Missy, and let's get this conversation started.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, Deborah. I am so happy to be here. I can't even imagine over a decade ago, probably sitting in your house talking about wanting to do a podcast together. And it took this much time, and here we are.
And here we are.
And if I recall, it was called Fourth Cup of Wine.
Third or fourth glass of wine.
Glass of wine, right. It was what comes out of us after that much wine. So we'll do our
Right.
best to give you all the good stuff today. And
Absolutely.
I'm really excited to interview you. I know you said that people want to hear more from you as opposed to your guests. And I'm the lucky person who gets to ask you, I think, anything I want.
Absolutely. Anything you want.
Oh boy. Watch out, everyone. Here we go. Anyway, I think I want to start out I've known you a really long time. You have always been in the world of sex and intimacy in one way or the other in your work and your mission and what you're passionate about. But how the heck did you get started with that? Like, where did that start? Because I don't think I even really know the answer to that question.
Yeah. So I think at the bottom, at the very beginning, I just was one of these people who was born with a lot of sensuality and a lot of curiosity. And over the years, it's always been a place where I've put my attention. So back in the day, I found my mother's version of
What I found of my parents, it was the joy of sex, the original.
That's it. Oh my
That's the
God.
one,
Thank you.
right? I know. Let's talk
So
about a way to feed a young person's curiosity. That book would definitely be a way.
well, I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but what I remember most about it was it had these beautiful pictures that came from the Kama Sutra, and they were incredibly artistic and quite explicit and anatomically incorrect.
Or at
So,
least
I
when
mean,
you
I
look at
just
that, you're like,
remember,
how does anyone ever make that happen?
right, right. That's really my first memory of a visual experience of sexuality. But then things just kind of kept coming up. I was curious about my own sensuality and sexuality and experimented a lot, learned how to give myself pleasure. I was lucky to grow up in San Francisco.
I was about to say, let's let our listeners know you grew up in San Francisco, where it's definitely maybe a little more open, a little more easy access to those
Right.
experiences.
I was super lucky. Growing up, my best friend's mom was the manager of the Stud and Hamburger Mary's. And back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, these were the places where alternative lifestyle happened. The Stud was and is a prominent gay bar. Like it was the place where people came together around sexuality and sensuality and gay liberation. And so I saw all of these different things. My babysitter, when I was 7, was a drag queen. So,
Wow.
I just had this really open view of sexuality that I grew up in. And then when I started my own sexual journey, I started at the Renaissance Fair, which, if anybody hasn't been, it's all about costumes, but underneath it, it's about power dynamics. And you have costumes and you have props. And there are all of these different improvs that we would play out in during the day. And then at night in actors camp, some of these games would continue. But I actually got to see a lot of different kinds of relationships. It was the first time I really saw what was possible in places like poly, or where people had more than one relationship, or what's considered leather families, which is families or groups of people who come together around kink. When I say that, I'm like, oh wow, I had a really diverse background, didn't I? But then I was thinking about it. My sister was in town and we were talking about seeing all of these different relationships play out around us. And the relationships that we saw that seemed successful tended to be the alternative ones, right? My mom was divorced, so that was one relationship we saw. The other more traditional straight relationships around us didn't look like a whole lot of fun. They were, a lot of animosity, not a lot of connection. Whereas the alternative relationships seem to have more juice, they seem to have more passion. Honestly, they seem to actually like each other better. My sister and I were talking about Mr. Johnson and his 2 wives. Like, we were 7 and 9, and it didn't even occur to us until, like, a year ago that they had a poly relationship. He had 2 women and many, many children, and it was awesome. Like, it was the place we wanted to be because there was a lot of joy in that family, a lot of love in that family, and a lot of just fun. So,
So
yeah.
it sounds like you definitely got a lot of different exposure to actually what I'm thinking about is one of the things I know you talk about now a lot is really creating your own relationship and creating it exactly how you want it to be. And there's no right or wrong. And it sounds like that early childhood exposure to a diversity of relationships and types of people and forms of sensuality and sexuality really is at the core of what you teach and advocate now around creating relationship and designing your relationship exactly how you want it to be.
Yeah, absolutely. What we see in mainstream is 2 people, and, it's a very narrow experience of what relationship is possible. It's also incredibly narrow around what sexually is possible. What we're shown is 2 people come together. Generally, they see each other across a crowded room. They come together, there's escalation, penetration, both people climax. They're generally, like, very loud, and both at the same time, and then the next scene we see is they're drinking coffee or something else, but, like, that's not the way that most people have sex. Like, it just isn't. Not because it's not mechanically accurate, but it's just that there's a lot of pieces that and preferences and experiences. Not everybody is that fast. Oftentimes, most women don't actually climax from penetrative sex. We generally need more stimulation on either clitoral or other parts of our body. Not all men are ejaculators, and climax is not the end of the experience. Anyway,
Certainly. I've heard
I
you say that many times. We could go down quite a path there, but we can leave it at that for now.
yeah,
Unless you have more to say about that.
I'm good for the moment.
Okay, you're good for the moment. Okay, so we've talked about different kinds of relationships you've seen. I know, and you share on your website and in various places, you've shared about your own relationship journey on the relating side of things, and it's taken you a while to figure that part out as well.
Oh,
It
yeah.
almost seems like the sensual sexual part was the easier part to figure out and the
Yeah, I would say that's probably accurate. I think that I'm somebody that just really has always been very embodied, very much liked, loved, enjoy living in my body, and very sensitive to touch and sound and the sexual experiences. So that's actually a lot easier than the interpersonal pieces. So I've been with my partner now for, let's see, I believe we're completing 23 years and going into 24. That whole time we've been non-monogamous. It's funny because while non-monogamy was something that was in my field for a really long time, in fact, when I was at camp, when I was like 13, I had my first experience of having two boyfriends. So even though it was in my field for a really long time, it never quite seemed to be for me. And so when I got together with my partner, he told me right off the bat, like, I'm not monogamous. That's not the kind of lifestyle I want. And I was like, okay, we'll see how this works out. And literally on the drive home, I was like, wow, if he doesn't have to be monogamous, then I don't have to be monogamous. And it was like, oh, there's this place of freedom. One of the things I want to say about non monogamy is all relationships, it can look however it is that suits the people involved. For some people, that means that they're allowed to flirt and cuddle with anybody and everybody. And that's the scope of their non monogamy. And then for other people, they have full on, fully formed relationships either internally woven with their partnerships or completely separate. And so there's a huge span. Over the years, our relationship has looked a lot of different ways. My partner tends to be much more my partner tends to be more relational than I tend to be when I date outside of experience. So I would say that I was more of a sport experiencer. I would want the experience of new people, and I would want the experience of, like, what's possible in Tantra, what's possible in Kink, what's possible in orgasmic meditation. Like, all of these different things were of interest to me, and they weren't so much of interest to my partner. So I had the freedom to go off and find other partners who would be interested. And so that's pretty much how we operated, where I was not so much in looking for lots of relationships as much as I was looking for lots of experiences. And he is much more wants to really go deeper with
Each
fewer
person.
people.
Yeah. So with all that exploration for you personally, that I understand. Tell us about turning that into your work and your business in the world. And I know that's had a number of different chapters and iterations along the way as well. But what made you decide to not just have it be your personal life, which many people do, but to also have that be your professional life?
Yeah, so a couple things happened. So first of all, I spent many, many years as a sensual masseuse, which I absolutely loved. And
How did that happen? How did you start that?
so I went to massage school, and the whole time it was like, the body's amazing, the body's beautiful, but don't touch these 8 inches. And so,
And
but
you were
I
like, that's the only part I want to touch. No.
well, it's not the only part I
Only
wanted
part.
to
I know. I'm
touch.
just joking.
Um, but it's awfully fun to see what happens when you do touch it. Whether it's on the male body or the female body, like, the mantra in the back of my head is always, whether in a sensual massage or in a BDSM scene or whatever, it's like, well, what happens if I do this? I pretty much knew going to massage school that I wanted to give a full body massage, and that included everything. And so I was again lucky to be in San Francisco and lucky to be in a place and a time when these skills were valued. And so I, for many years, did sensual massage. It was amazing. It was a great experience. I loved working with my clients and loved the opportunity to give and receive pleasure and to have that as not just a vocation as well as a place of passion.
All the years I've known you, it's always amazed me that you can do that and enjoy it and do it so well. Like, some of us are just built for that and some of us aren't. You and I were having a conversation the other day about attraction and desire. Do you remember? You said
I
something about, I'm totally impressed and amazed at how you can find a way to have attraction with anyone, which I think is also part of who you are as a person, of really caring and giving full attention and compassion to every person. But in the physical realm, I've always been impressed because I just don't have that thing, and I think a lot of people don't, but some people like yourself do. It's super amazing.
Well, I truly believe that turn on starts over here. I can close my eyes and I can slow down and I can put my attention down on my pussy and my breath and like there
There you are.
I am. And so I think that when I'm turned on and when I would show up, I can show up in that space. And so it helps the people I'm with to actually drop into their own bodies and to create their own turn on. It's funny. I love humans one on one. As a species, I'm not so sure. But like, there is something about being in front of somebody and allowing yourself to drop in, or at least for me, when I allow myself to drop in to find my own turn on, and then I allow that to be what guides me and I can see in that other person, like the vulnerability in that space is exquisite.
Can
Um,
you give everyone a little, I mean, you started to describe just your own way, but can you give us a little how to drop into that if we wanted to play with that ourselves?
sure. So, I mean, I think for me, the first thing is feeling my own body. So oftentimes it's feeling my feet and then the place of contact. And then even just taking my hands and having them on my thighs and actually feeling the warmth of my thighs, feeling the hair underneath my fingers, and then bringing my attention down to the base of my spine and just allowing myself to slow down and take a deep breath into the nose and feeling that feeling of fullness at the top and exhaling, giving a little bit of a squeeze to the genitals or a lift and just yeah, that's where I would start.
Thank you. I love that you said that about your hands on your thighs because I have shared with so many of my friends when I've been out dancing your lesson on how to always dance sexy. May I share that? Uh,
Absolutely.
so, listeners, if you ever want to look sexy or hot on the dance floor, no matter how good or bad you dance, just put your hands on the top part of your thighs, on the front of your thighs, and keep them there as you move. And it all looks sexy and it feels sexy. Like it feels sexy in your own body. So then it becomes even sexier. And I don't remember where we were clubbing or dancing when you taught me that, but I tell so many friends that when I'm out and I do it plenty of times to get myself into that place. So I love that that was part of this meditation as well.
Oh, yeah. So in Tantra, there are three very basic, broad techniques. So, Tantra is a big word. It's got a big history, it's got many lineages, is a Sanskrit word for weave. And for me, it's basically a spiritual practice that allows the body as a vehicle for union with self, for union with another, for union with something bigger, for union with spirit. And it's been my personal practice for the last, gosh,
Longer than
15.
I've known you.
So for the last 20 years, it's really been my practice. But what I was going to say is within Tantra, there are three very main practices or techniques. And the first is movement. And so that can mean anything from just like bringing your attention down to your genitals, taking a and lifting and releasing, or it can be a full on out in the middle of the forest dancing around the bonfire and everything in between. But movement is super important for well being. It's important for great sex. It's important for good sex. Very important. Then the next one is breath. And if you think about it, I mean, it makes perfect sense. It's like if when we stop
Well,
breathing,
if yeah, you're dead if you're not breathing. So that's
right, and when
pretty
you stop breathing, you're dead. It's like we can use breath as a vehicle to slow ourselves down when we take deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. That's a cooling breath, right? But it's also, there's ways if we need more energy. There's breath techniques that are heating breaths. And if you think about it in sex, and oftentimes when we get close to climax, people will generally hold their breath and that's you might want to consider the next time that you are, whether you're self-pleasuring or with a partner, but as you start to build that sexual attention and you get closer to the edge, see what happens when you hold your breath, but see what happens when you actually consciously take a deep breath or a
Mm.
slow breath. It's really fun to play with. And
I
then
yeah, I always found breath super interesting coming from body work and various meditation backgrounds as well, because it's something to me, the breath has always been a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious mind or subconscious mind, because it sort of subconsciously is happening all the time. We don't not thinking 24/7 about breathing, but you're always breathing. But then you can consciously take it over. Mostly no other body function that works like that. And so I think that's why a lot of meditation practices and transcendent practices use breath in those ways. And I also think it's interesting because your breath can tell you information about your state, but then you can also use it to change your state. It's super potent tool.
yeah.
Yeah. So what's the third?
The third is sound, right? And if you think about it, sound is so powerful, whether we're making the sounds of the body or whether we're actually speaking things into being. It could be something along the lines of when we are connecting with ourselves, it may be just more guttural sounds or sounds of the body. Or when we are with a partner, it could be giving them adoration about what it's like to be in their presence, or how much we love them, or how sexy we find them, or how much we're just like driven to be with them in this moment because, oh my God, your presence is overtaking me. I mean, there's just sound is awesome. And then it
Cool.
really is, it's part of our magic, right? When we declare something, right? When we say something and make that statement, and this is what we want, there's power there. And whether it is in, manifesting that we wish to bring into the world, or whether it is a way that we want to expand our sexuality, there's a lot of power there in both the sounds and the words.
Thank you for that quick tantra lesson. That was awesome. So I know, I mean, you've talked about so far, your life sounds amazing and fun, but I know like relationship was not always that way. I know you've had any human relating to other humans.
Mm.
There's challenges. And I know in the relationship side of things, it definitely was a journey for you of figuring that out. So before you got to this point of having been an expert in this field of relationship and intimacy and sex for over 2 decades, are there some turning points or moments
Oh,
where, you
absolutely.
crashed bottom with relationship? Like give us the nitty-gritty. Let us know you're like the rest of us and you're not a perfect
Absolutely.
expert.
Yeah,
Is there a major relationship, something that really kind of woke you up or shifted things for you?
there are a couple of big turning points for me. I was pretty shameless in my sex. My boyfriends came from the Renaissance fair. We had a shared language, we had a shared way of doing things. And then when I stopped dating guys from the Renaissance fair, it was like I started dating guys who didn't have this as their baseline. And so they were like, "Well, what do you mean you want me to
Dress up in costume and carry a sword around. Yeah.
yeah, what do you mean you want me to be your stable boy and you want to be my mistress? What do you mean you want to be the washerwoman and I'm going to be the great lord?" Like there was this huge disconnect. And the thing about that is that it just brought up all this shame. It made me feel like too much. I felt too lusty, too busty, too much, right? And so that was really hard because then I shut things down a little bit. Actually, I shut things down a lot. And I started dating from the list. And what I mean by that is oftentimes when we're dating, we're told we should make a list of what we want. And so I made this list of like, I wanted a guy who was going, and the list was all about me changing for them, right? So he
For
was gonna
example, what give us an example of what you mean by that.
I really wanted just to be normal, right? Like, I wanted to have a boyfriend that I could go to,
You wanted a
um
quote normal boyfriend, so you would have to be normal with them.
Right. Well, I wanted a normal boyfriend, and I didn't realize about if he was normal, then I would kind of have to be normal too. And what that meant to me at that time was like normal, respectable, kind of more from the movies kind of guy. And I also really was wanting, at one point, I was really wanting somebody that was going to be super masculine and like, so I could be in my super feminine. And needless to say, none of these things worked out very well. I was chasing a stereotype.
Like you were talking about the stereotype from movies, because I feel like I've noticed in the past number of years, because I'm totally a sucker for a romantic movie, always will be, that it's changed. And I see more romance movies, especially ones that are young people romance movies, where it is about the quirky person who's not quite, quote, normal. Like, there's more of those coming out now. And I'm curious if you've noticed that or what you think about that shift in what culture is saying relationship is or isn't.
Yeah, I feel like there's definitely becoming more freedom and more acknowledgement around not just the diversity of types of people and types of relationships there are, but like what is compelling to see. And I think what's really compelling is authenticity. I think that when people are willing to show up quirky and weird,
Mhm.
although some of us can't help that anyway, but
True.
we make peace with that, you know? It's like there's a depth that we can go to. There is a connection that's possible because we're willing. I think the best conversations and connections I have are always the deeper ones where they're more vulnerable. In one of my relationships, I used to say, the edgy thing I don't want to say is, right? It was enough of a lead in to be able to share that thing that's edgy for me.
You've actually made that part of your work too, because you often talk about answering the questions for people that make them blush. It's like that edgy thing that they really want to know, but they don't know who to ask, or they're a little embarrassed to ask anyone. That's become such a big part of how you show up with your clients and with people, with your
Yeah.
friends as well, I would say, because we all call you with all those questions, thinking about a recent call myself and another friend made to you.
Right,
With
right.
exactly those questions. It's like,
Well,
"Wait, you've got a question? I know the person to answer it."
right. Well, I think being willing to lead with vulnerability allows others to be able to show up. And being willing to claim that part of me slash us that is alternative, that doesn't fit in the box, allows for much more interesting and fertile conversations.
So, in a moment, I wanna ask you more about the things that don't fit in the box, like you've touched on a little bit kink, and also, how to lead with vulnerability and your deep dive into communication and relationship. But before I ask you those things, I know you've got something exciting coming up that you would like to tell us about. Why don't you share that first?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I am so freaking excited. I had this moment where I was like, I think I need to do more with the podcast. And so the Better Sex for Couples Summit was born. And I'm bringing together a dozen experts to talk about three main areas of sexuality that I feel like are the building blocks of what makes great sex. And that's communication and empowerment and pleasure. And so it's a free 3-day online event. And it is specifically for couples, but not limited to couples. So if you're interested in having better sex, about listening and learning, then I hope that you'll join us. It will be in the show notes so that you can learn more. You can join us. And it's coming in February, the first weekend in February. Super excited. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I've had the great privilege of having a little behind the scenes sneak peek. And what I can say is if you're listening to this and you want to improve your sex life, you want to explore like the whole range of topics of intimacy and deepening connection with your partner and so much on these three areas: communication, relationship, empowerment, and pleasure, or what I call bedroom skills. This is definitely the summit to be at. So, Deborah, what's the website one more time so people can sign up now? A little bit of early bird waitlist sign up. It's what is it?
Better Sex for Couples Summit.com.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank
So,
you.
you're welcome. I'm so excited for it. It's going to be super fun. The guests are amazing. Like I said, I've had an early sneak peek behind the scenes, peek behind the curtain experience of it. So I
Yeah, and
highly recommend getting there.
I'm looking at really covering things that people don't often talk about. In the communication section, we're going to be talking about how do you repair? How do you have your vulnerability? How do you have your boundaries? And how do you have that repair conversation so that you can come back together again? Right? In the empowerment section, we're talking about how to be an empowered being with another empowered being and how to both have what you want without having to compromise and give up on things that are important to you. And in the pleasure section, well, there's all sorts of good stuff in the pleasure section.
Yes, there's all sorts of good stuff, but I know there'll be a little bit bondage and kink conversation. I know there'll be a little bit of like the actual chemistry of sex and how to work with it for your pleasure. What else?
Oh my goodness. We talk about what happens when you've got two different people who come from two different points of view and how do you find each other? And each of the guests are bringing real tips and strategies that you can play with right away. Just like we were talking earlier in how to move your breath and how to turn yourself on. There's all sorts of moments like that throughout the summit.
And I think one of the cool things is, like you've mentioned, you have over 2 decades of experience in this field of sex, intimacy, and relationships, and you know everybody. Seriously, like everybody. If you don't personally know them, you know at least know of them. You've studied their work. You're aware of who they are, and so I think this is so exciting because you're bringing together these over 2 decades of your experience and connections all in one place for people. Whereas usually you'd have to like go to this expert and go to that expert and Google this topic and then Google that topic, and you're bringing it all into one place, all your years of experience and all the relationships and connections you've spent all this time building to share it with people and to further your mission of happier people because they have better sex in the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool. So I want to get back to, you were talking about vulnerability and you've also mentioned kink a little bit. So I wanted to get, you talked a lot about studying Tantra and some of your experience with Tantra and different modalities and different schools of that. Where does the kink come into all this? And like, how do those two things even go together? Because they seem, if you don't know a lot about it, they seem like kind of, they don't work together. Like one is super spiritual and meditative and
So
the
I
other
think
doesn't
it's
seem like it is.
right. I mean, I think it's a big mistake to look at kink and say, oh, that's not spiritual. And I think it's a big mistake to look at Tantra and say, oh, that is not grounded. And I believe that's where the two kind of come together. It's like if you think about, for instance, the idea of, well, first of all, I just have to say that kink, again, is a very broad subject.
Why don't
And
you just define, I dove right into that without even, why don't you tell our listeners in case they're have their own ideas, like what do you mean by kink?
sure. So I believe the dictionary definition basically says that kink is something as an alternative sexual experience. And basically, if you get out of missionary position, you are kinky. And then the broader, more general terminology or thoughts about it tends to look at the umbrella of BDSM. And BDSM is basically three different concepts: it's bondage and discipline, sadomasochism,
On dominant submissive.
and dominance and submission. And so these are three different concepts of how you work together. So, for instance, with dominance and submission, that's about playing with power. That's about playing with the dynamics. And if you think about Tantra for a moment, right? They're the dynamics of the feminine and the masculine and how those two play together. So I think of that with the dominance and submission. So S&M tends to be about sensation, right? It tends to be one person really likes to give sensation, one person really likes to receive sensation. And the bondage and discipline, that tends to be also in the body. And one of the ways that, like I said, I didn't even realize I was kinky until I stopped playing with kinky people because it just
That
was
was your
such
normal. You didn't even know there was something else.
right. But like we really played with a lot of different things. Like, how does sensuality, how is it enhanced when when you, for instance, wear a blindfold, right? How is sensuality accentuated when you are restrained? And I know for me, in my own experience, being restrained was a huge deal. Like, it was because I'm a bit of a control freak. I'll just put that right out there. But it was really a turning point for my relationship, right? Because he'd wanted to try it. I was no, because I'd always thought, oh, he's going to tie me up and he's going to like just mess with me. He's going to poke me and it's going to be horrible. But then it was this idea of what if I tie you up? And what if I'm right there? And what if I want to keep you warm and safe and sensual? And I was just like, hmm.
Well, that could happen too, huh?
Yeah, and so we basically negotiated, which meant that we basically decided what was going to be in our playtime and how long our playtime is going to be, and what signals we were going to give to each other if it was time to end, and then, how we wanted to end our time together. And so it was really quite cathartic because I had this safe place to lose control. Right? I had something to push up against.
That reminds me of what you recently wrote about having grown up in foster care and have partially lived in foster care and how that gave you that same thing, that container and boundaries to push against.
Yeah, very much so. So it's like there's the physical aspect of pushing up against something and the emotional roller coaster that can go with that. And then boundaries being a place to, again, push up against, but in a more intellectual, emotional way.
I think of boundaries like that, like Tupperware container, right? Where all the
Yeah,
stuff can slosh around and not spill out, right? When you have a
right.
good tight container, everything can be messy inside and splash and spill, and you can like toss the container around and it doesn't go all over the place and all over everyone.
Right, and if it does happen to explode, there's a mechanism for cleaning it up. There's a
A paper towel,
mechanism.
yeah.
Right, paper towel or a reconciliation
Conversation, yeah.
process. And one of the things I found both in playing with restraint and boundaries physically and just the emotional boundaries is that, like, freedom is really an inside job. Like, I feel like I can find more freedom in a 3 by 5 space than I can if there's quote unlimited if there's no boundaries.
And that seems very counterintuitive to what one would usually think, which is also what brings me to a question about kink. Because if you hear anything about kink, you usually hear someone say that the submissive is the one with all the power, which is counterintuitive in a similar way. But can you like say what that actually means? Because I've never hear anyone really they say that phrase or trope, but they don't actually. How does that actually work?
Well, I think in a very basic way, if you're playing with safe words are a communication skill. And basically what it is it's a way for the sub and the dom or to communicate what's actually going on and how much intensity is going on in the scene. For instance, I like to use the safe word mercy to let my sub, so I generally dom, I'll tell my sub will have 2 safe words. One will be mercy, which lets me know that they're on the edge. This is good. They don't want me to stop, but they're at 75% or more. And then red tends to be the safe word that stops the play. And so I think what people say often, what people mean when they say that the sub is in charge, is the sub can end the scene by calling red.
I think it seems to me that also the sub choosing to sub is a moment of power.
Absolutely. But I mean, it's stepping into either submission or dominance is it can be a very empowering experience because if you think about it, if you're stepping into the dominant role, what that means is you are creating a container. You are creating an atmosphere. You are holding the sub. The sub is given the opportunity to surrender, right? The opportunity to let their walls down, to not have to think they don't have to do anything. They're in the response, both the dom and the sub, if they're doing it well, it's a give and take, a response, and a dance of sorts. But both aspects are very powerful. It's incredibly powerful for somebody who spends their life making decisions, making choices very tight to allow themselves the gift of submission, right? It's funny. I think the gift of one of the things we often talk about in kink or BDSM is the gift of submission, right? Giving the dom the gift of your submission. But I think it's even more personal than that, like giving yourself the gift of submission, the gift to be the slosh.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're typically like a type A, tightly wound, in control person or in charge and decision maker of everything, to like give yourself the gift of relief. It's like a release valve to not have to make decisions, at least for an hour or whatever, for one part of your life for a few minutes. That actually probably helps you be the boss everywhere else, to have that place where you can let go of control and let go of leadership.
Yeah, also you learn how to collaborate. I mean, ultimately, this is a collaboration, but I would say that ultimately all relationship is collaboration.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to my next question or thought is like, it seems to me you talk about the major areas of communication, empowerment, and bedroom skills. And we also talk about Tantra and Kink and all your skill and expertise in all that. And the glue that seems to hold it together or that is required is the relationship communication piece. Without that, it seems like none of the other can happen. You're not going to feel empowered with yourself or with someone else. You're not going to have pleasure in what you're doing or not doing. Say more about how you dove into how you discovered the key role that relationship and communication plays in the whole enchilada.
Yeah, well, I think hearing you say that, I would say, and since we've been talking about it, it's probably just having the practice of communicating and creating a scene together through the kink world, right? And one of the things I love about kink is so much is talked about, right? Dan Savage talks about how straight people, there's an expectation of what's going to happen when you come together. So we don't really talk about our likes and our dislikes, right? If there's two straight people coming together, the assumption is there's going to be a pussy and a cock, and at some point there's going to be penetration and climax, right? And
Maybe a
that
kiss in the middle. Yeah,
maybe
go
a
on.
kiss in the middle, right? But we don't actually take a whole lot of time to actually talk about what we like and how we like it and where we like it and when we like it, right?
And that's like a baseline of kink is
Absolutely.
to have
So
that conversation.
right. The baseline of kink is it's like, oh, what are you into? Really? I'm into this. You're into that. We've got some overlap. Then the next question is, do we want to play together? Then the next question is, so we've decided we want to play together. Then we get to decide what version we're going to play. Who is going to take what role? What
What do
is
we
going
not want?
what do we
Yeah.
not want? What do we want? How am I going to recognize that you're getting what you want, right? For
And
some
just
people,
imagine if we took that into every relationship. Wow. That
right?
would transform the planet, but it would transform so many partnerships.
I mean, it's so interesting. One of the things that's so fascinating to me. So, I work with couples mostly now, and there's something so awesome about that because I am endlessly curious. And it's fascinating because oftentimes I start the conversation and I sit back and I allow them to actually talk about things they've never talked before. So, one of the questions is, what am I going to see to know that you are enjoying yourself? Right. And I had a couple not too long ago, and we were talking about this, and she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna close my eyes and sit back," right? And for him, like they'd been together for 15 years or something, and he was like, when you do that, I thought that you weren't interested anymore.
Oh, wow. That changed their whole relationship, that one sentence.
Seriously. And
Yeah.
for him, like, it was so important to be able to see her and have her look at him and everything else. And for her, it was like, that was a revelation. It was like, oh. So basically, we did this exercise where we basically had them go back and forth. We set a timer for 2.5 minutes. And so every time the timer went off, so he would start and she would go into her, she would close her eyes for a while and he would touch her. And then the timer would go off and she would open her eyes and she would touch him for a while. And then the timer would go off and then she'd be allowed to close her eyes and he would touch her for a while. And so it was just this really interesting back and forth that they got to play with. And what they really got was that A, nothing was wrong. He wasn't checking out, or she wasn't checking out. His need or desire for more of her was not feeling overwhelming because she was allowed some of her own, she was allowed to have her style and he was allowed to have his style. Anyway, I digress. There you go.
No, that was great. That was great. That was a good example of the communication piece. I know in my own relationships, first husband and I had a conversation a number of years after we were divorced because I have the unique skill in staying with friends with most exes. And all of a sudden, like all this stuff that had happened between us, it was like, oh, when you said that, you meant this. And oh, that's what you were actually feeling when you walked out the door. It had nothing to do. And like that repaired our whole friendship, that one conversation. And I don't even remember the details, but I can remember the energy of the revelation. I can picture where I was sitting when we were on the phone having this conversation, and that repaired. And we're good friends still. We talk every now and then and stay in touch. It's revelatory when that happens. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, that's what you meant.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what you meant.
And even just it's fascinating, like, we'll have conversations, and I'll watch my clients have conversations and completely miss what each other is saying. And
Mhm.
so I have some guests who do an excellent, excellent job of this, of working with
Translating. Yeah.
with this dynamic, which is basically listening to your partner, asking, replying back to them as to what it is they just said, and asking them if they got that right. And if they didn't get that right, then making a few adjustments. If they did get that right, then moving the conversation forward. And it's really interesting, like, how much that will change things. So, one of the advantages I have of being in relationship for so long and being in relationship to this particular person, I like to say that in the beginning, I got together with him because he had a solid no. And I really needed that. Like, I'm a bit, and I'm passionate, and it's really easy to get people on my ride when I get passionate and excited, but he had such a solid no that I could come up against that. And it's been a lifelong challenge of like, well, where do we meet each other? And how do we meet each other? We have very, very different practices in the world. He is a martial artist. And
And an
so,
artist.
and an artist. So his practices are very different than mine. So it's been finding the overlap and getting to bring home all of these different things that I've learned to see how they work with him.
There's one of my favorites that you've used, which is, I don't know if you still do it, but how you would write notes. Would
Yeah,
you share
so
that? Because that was such a great
sure.
little, I
Sure,
love
sure,
that
sure.
story.
So I'm a big believer in the love languages, in part because
And you could put info to love languages. We're not going to get in deep discussion, but you could put that in the show notes. So if people want to know
oh, yeah, yeah. Okay.
what she's talking about.
Thank you. So basically, we have very different love languages. His words of affirmation. So he needs to hear how much I
How
appreciate
lovely he
and
is.
love and I'm
Yes.
turned on by. And all of these things need to be verbal. And more acts of service, which is all about show me, right? Show me how you love me. And so back in the day, I used to bring him a cup of chai every morning. And for me, this was my version of telling him I loved him and I wanted him to have a good day. And it was my blessings. And it was just like, it was a deal. Like there was a whole ritual
You were
for
speaking
me.
your love language to him,
I
which
was speaking my love language to him, and he was receiving a cup of tea, right? And so I would get completely blown out because I wasn't being received. And he would look at me like, what's going on, woman? Like, you're
Don't you love me still,
overreacting.
or
It's
don't you?
a
Yeah.
cup of tea. But then when I realized like, oh, this is what he needs, I started incorporating that. And I am not great at telling people because I like to be shown. So I actually went and did a little bit of research. And one of the ways that I really like to tell him I love him and remind him and whatnot is I'll put notes everywhere. And every once in a while, a note will fall out of like a drawer or something. And it shifted things around so much for us. And for instance, now when he takes the trash out, he lets me know that he's going to take the trash out. And I get to tell him how much I think it's sexy and fabulous. And it's a thing between us now.
Well, I recall too, there was a time where you would write him a note, but then you would also list something you'd
Ah,
love
yes.
done. You'd let him know how to show you love in return.
Right. So on the front, it would say how much I appreciated him and everything he did and the way he was and the way he was showing up. And then on the back, there'd be a list of 3 things that needed to be done around the house that needed to be
Yeah.
done.
And that's the
And
power of communication and really doing the work on relationship communication.
yeah, yeah. It's really funny that you mentioned that because it's like we have become together list makers, which I on my own am not a list maker. He on his own is not a list maker. But together we put together lists so that A, things get done and B, I can feel loved.
That's so sweet. That's so sweet. So, we have talked about so many different things, so many different topics. We could go on and on forever, but we do have to end this podcast at some point. So, just a reminder to listeners that Deborah's got the Better Sex for Couples Summit coming up, and the link is in the show notes, and it's bettersexforcouplesummit.com. And all these topics that we talked about today, she goes deep into. And one of the things I love that you got to hear in this conversation is how, whether it's Tantra or other kinds of sex or kink or missionary style or the relationship and communication, like all these things, Deborah has this unique way, having studied and taught and dived deep into all these different topics, to see how they all relate to each other and teach each other. Just like she was talking about how the communication that happens in a kink scene can actually teach you how to relate, how to communicate in your relationship in general. I mean, I've just known Deborah a really long time, and I see all these ways that it all weaves together, and she takes all the lessons from these seemingly separate places and carries them through to the other places. And that's really, I think, what she's bringing together in this summit and in all the work that she does with her clients. And you got to hear some samples of that. So, Deborah, like having talked about all these things and me just sharing what I see, I'm kind of curious before we finish here if there's a last thought or piece of wisdom or something. Like, what do you want listeners to get out of this conversation we had, except to know that you're the person to ask the questions that make them blush? But otherwise, what do you hope
Yeah,
people walk away from listening to our conversation get?
I think there's a couple things. One is that relationships are a unique experience and they are unique to the 2 people who are having them. And so it's a combination of all of the skills that you bring together. And sometimes there's skills that we need some support around. And so, really being curious, not just about what goes well, but sometimes what's not going well points to what your next experience is about. So, just know that, like, there are people who can support you, that relationships are more complicated than the storybook tells us. And so they're unique to you. They are an opportunity for personal growth, and that you don't have to do them alone, and that more is possible than you could even imagine. I think that one of the things I say when I talk about relationships and sex is that our bodies are these amazing instruments. And it's like we're never really given any instruction around them. So if we're lucky, we figure out how to play chopsticks. If we're really lucky, we find somebody else to play the other part of chopsticks. But when we get to actually play with our bodies, and learn how to do a solo, learn how to do a duet, maybe make it into a quartet,
Orchestra, yeah.
perhaps even join the orchestra. There is so much possibility, but it does start with curiosity and really wanting to be open to what's possible.
I think the essence of who you are and what you stand for and what you teach and give to people you support, there's not many people I've ever met like you in that there's no right or wrong. There's right
Mm,
for you, which is different than right or wrong attached to judgment. And you have this way that you create this world and space that your clients and your friends and colleagues and everyone around you steps into where you're okay and right just how you are. And I think in something so vulnerable with so much stigma and taboo like sex and intimacy and relationship, that's a really important space to hold of there's no right or wrong. There's what's right for you.
yeah.
There's no judgment around that. So I just want to give that last acknowledgement to you about that. And thank you for holding that space because it creates so much safety for so many people. And thank you for all that you do and for sharing your stories and your insights today. And in this conversation, it was super fun to like throw you on the other side of the mic and ask you the questions. And for our listeners, she had no idea really what I was going to ask her. I didn't tell her ahead of time. So this is true, genuine, straight from the heart, Deborah here. I hope you enjoyed my questions and what she shared. And I don't know, Deborah, if you have anything last you want to say.
Just, super appreciate your skill and asking questions and in helping me to like pinpoint in what I'm up to. And I feel so grateful that you're such a glorious friend. So, yeah. And again, I truly believe that your support is part of what catalyst and help get the Better Sex podcast out into the world. So, thank
I'm
you so
excited. I'm
much.
excited for anyone who's doing podcasts. It's definitely a fun way to share wisdom and
Absolutely.
share other people.
Absolutely. So I'm going to take back the mic for just a moment and
Take it. It's
say
all yours.
this has been so much fun, and I'm so happy to had the opportunity to be interviewed by my dear friend Missy. And for those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us on this journey, on this conversation. There are going to be so many more interesting conversations. Again, if you have questions or comments, please let me know. Let us know. You can find us at deborahtantracat@gmail.com in the show notes, and a big invitation and welcome to join the Better Sex for Couples Summit. And again, in the show notes, this is Deborah Cat, the Better Sex podcast, saying thank you so much for joining the conversation. Please like, subscribe, and comment. And we'll see you on the next conversation. Thank you so much.